Hello, everybody. It's Mmmm here of Positive Fandom. I hope you are all well. It is Labor Day weekend 2022 here in the US. It's a big holiday weekend. I'm in New York and the weather couldn't be more beautiful. I'm getting ready to go out on the boardwalk, enjoy myself on the beach. And before I'm heading out there, I did want to record my review on the Princess documentary, which came out on HBO regarding the life of Princess Diana. I know on a weekend like this, many of you may be home, and there's a lot to choose from watching out there. Certainly a lot of interesting programming, things that are certainly worth your while to watch. But I did want to mention how Princess Diana pretty much changed the world. And one thing that it did remind me of as I watched this documentary pretty much is that none of us are promised tomorrow. So I do just want to share my thoughts about this documentary. It's called The Princess and it's on HBO. So I'm talking about this documentary that came out shortly, maybe about a week or so ago. And a few days ago or so was the 25th anniversary of Princess Diana's death. And it was a tragic one. And it is hard to believe that she passed away at the age of, I believe it was 36, in her 30s. At the time, I was not as old as that. And now it's 25 years later. And the thought of how many years have passed and to lose your life at such a young age truly is tragic, even now to think about it. But I did want to talk about this documentary. There have been many, many documentaries made about Princess Diana through the years, and I've seen almost all of them. Recently, Kristen Stewart made a movie about Princess Diana, specifically focusing on one fateful Christmas that she spent with the family before her divorce, I believe. So Princess Diana has been a huge topic of conversation even after 25 years has passed since her death. And looking at this documentary, it has a lot of British footage of the royals' lives, in particular Princess Diana and her husband, Charles, and her children. And to be honest with you, the British royals may be the royal family that has the most well-documented on-camera lives pretty much in modern history. So I know at one time, Princess Diana was the most photographed woman in the world. And there were so many elements of her life that are not easily describable in one or two sentences. So I think that this documentary certainly was a step in the right direction to address, pretty much what the impact she had on the world. And, the footage in this documentary certainly initially paints what I would call a non-biased view of Charles and Diana, hoping that the viewer can form an opinion of their history and understand the impact they had, especially in regards to the media. In 1981, the media just wouldn't leave Charles and Diana alone for 1 minute. And there was so much excitement surrounding this wedding. It certainly was something that was exciting for me. I'm an Anglophile and I enjoyed watching the wedding and have watched it several times. It was exciting and thrilling, and it had a lot of hope associated with it, as many weddings do. And it did feel like a fairy tale, although I should note that Diana did come from very well-off means as an aristocrat herself. She certainly wasn't a pauper, but it did have a feel of this sort of magical sense to it that everybody seemed to be able to relate to and just enjoy. So I think that pretty much every element of Charles and Diana's lives were documented in a way that we haven't seen before or since. They were constantly the topic of discussion and conversation in the 80s. And so the documentary starts to maybe sway and perhaps, or at least talk about the trouble that Diana faced when she became more and more popular, so much so that her popularity seemed to eclipse the royal family itself and perhaps anyone in existence. But we've never seen anything like this before. And she pretty much became that person. And hearing in the documentary, the media journalists analyze their behavior in every activity they participate in, from skiing to whether they were arguing, kind of, in a sense, created a more realistic lifestyle, since they had tried to paint them as having maybe even perhaps the perfect life. And that became shattered as time went by. This introduction to discussing someone's infidelity in public, the idea of, whether it was real or imagined. We hear Diana talk about her role as a wife and a mother, and her frustration gets manifested as she constantly reached out to other people. And for the most part, she reached out to people in society who were outcasts and pretty much unpopular. And those people became even more important in her eyes, and I think in humanity's eyes as well. And this conscious behavior made Princess Diana and her husband gain even more attention. As it appears in the documentary, what it failed to do was to reinforce any confidence whatsoever to the public that the royal couple were happy with one another. Culminating with a visit where Diana goes to the Taj Mahal. And even I remember the newspaper headlines at the time where Diana was sitting on a bench in one of the viewpoints from the Taj Mahal behind her. And they, I remember some of the newspapers printed on the top of the headlines, it said, "So alone." And it was clear. It was clear that, there might have been some trouble in the marriage. And the idea of, seeing these sort of tell-all books that would come out where Diana's personal life was now being reported. It wasn't just a problem in the marriage. Now she had behavior problems where she might have had suicide attempts, or they alleged that she had some other problems. And they kind of suggested or implied that a lot of that had to do with how Charles and her relationship was, specifically how he may or may not have been treating her. So, you have one side of the documentary where you can hear some reporters or commentators, whoever they may be, they're not identified, as saying that Diana is the best thing to happen to the British monarchy. At the same time, saying things like their marriage or implying that their marriage was a marriage of convenience, is just some of the judgments that they were faced with. And no one can truly know what kind of effect that had on them, having to wake up in the morning knowing that the entire world had a comment about what their lives may or may not have been. What I can say is that I've heard in many relationships, there may have been resentment, and, that can cause problems no matter what. But the documentary goes on to say, and even imply in some cases, that there's an institution of the monarchy and it has its flaws. And I think that looking from the outside in, by the end of the documentary, it's clear to the person who watches it that this situation was an incredibly complicated, complex relationship of all the players involved. And it was a very difficult thing to deal with. And unfortunately, they both, Charles and Diana, were subject to a lot of judgment. And regardless of whether what they were doing was right or wrong, it was greater judgment, I would say, than the average person or even monarch ever had to deal with in their lives previously. So, there was this book that came out, and there's so many books that came out in different things, hit pieces. A book is a hit piece. about Diana being in an unstable state. And I remember when that book came out, I questioned, why did this come out at all? Why were there released recordings? Isn't this an invasion of privacy? But, this is just something that happened and they had to endure it. And I think that something else in regards to when they finally did separate, when Charles and Diana finally did separate, and the Queen had her famous speech about it being an annus horribilis. I think that some of the comments that were made in the documentary and by some of the people who were involved in it, because it wasn't just comments made in the documentary by reporters, but by ordinary British citizens as well. You could hear one person mention, quote, "We no longer live in an era where there is an arranged marriage, and that's that." And so I think that, it's 1992, one of the persons had said. And so perhaps it is hard to kind of look at 2022 and go back to imagine a world where the idea of these concepts were still being looked at as whether they should be followed, and regardless of what happens as a consequence of it, you just stick it out, or is it better to make some changes? I also think that the film does also focus on the media quite a bit. And at some point, the media is true. It is true when they say that the royals did invite them in, and that at this point, they can't turn off the cameras now. They can't go back. Even when the princess begged for privacy, was it too late? I think maybe it was. And, we get to see situations where, she's just doing the simplest of activities and it's being monitored to a point where it's extreme. So after the divorce, after the interviews that she and her husband had about their relationship, which was, I think I would be devastated if I had to do a public interview about a relationship that I had with someone that I cared about deeply. I think that would just shatter me, but she did it, and Charles followed up with it. You can hear in the documentary where they say that Diana has 30 to 40 years of public life ahead of her. And, she had gone into doing more humanitarian work, and she won Humanitarian Work of the Year. And then she was involved with the team that won the Nobel Prize for these landmines. And then a lot of people were talking about, well, they wanted to see her happy. She's so young. Of course she'd want to be with someone. Of course she'd want to have a life where she can be with someone who cares about her and be happy. And, there was a comment that it said Diana needs a billionaire for her lifestyle. And I thought, it's not so much the money, is it? She needs someone who can protect her. She was so popular, and so many people could, perhaps not have the best intentions for her, that she would need round the clock bodyguards. She would need all of these things. And I can't honestly remember whether she got that after the divorce, but when she met Dodi, it seemed like he had that level of protection for her, and that perhaps this was going to work, but there seemed to be resentment towards that. And, just at the height of this romance, or the start of a romance with him, and they deliberately showed the poor woman who was engaged to Dodi and was kind of, he broke the engagement off with her, I guess, to be with Diana. And it does happen. There's this terrible loss of where Diana does lose her life in this tragic car accident. And it was almost unbelievable. No one wanted to believe it. After all, we'd been watching and seeing different headlines of Diana that were not in the best light, and many of which may not have been true. And they had this very touching video of these gentlemen who were playing cards, and they had heard that Diana was in a car accident. And they kind of joked it off because it seemed like such a unbelievable story at the time. But once this gentleman heard that she had passed away, he got quite emotional. I still get a little emotional about it, and I think the reason why we get emotional about it is because of what she was trying to do and what she was trying to achieve. And I think she achieved it. It's just that it's so tragic because if she had lived longer, certainly her children and family would have had more time to enjoy and celebrate all these things that you want to do and spend time with your loved ones. But we all benefited from many of the things that the princess did. And so when you lose someone like that, there are so many people who are affected, and it really did affect the whole world. And I'll never forget when, first of all, I've never seen so many people respond in that level of mourning in my life. I've never seen that before. You know, it was very, you know, I think it changed the way that we look at mourning and what's acceptable, what's an acceptable way to say that you are hurting. I'd say that her death might have been one of the factors that initiated the idea of talking about your feelings in public, and that we all have emotions and that we have to deal with those emotions, and it's important to do that. So I think that her unfortunate death was one of the things that catapulted a movement towards talking about your feelings and emotions. But another thing that I will also remember is her being called by the prime minister at the time, whose name I can't remember. It might have been Tony Blair, but I could have gotten that wrong, as he comes out and makes a brief speech a few days after her passing, calling her the people's princess. And that still gets me a little choked up. So, and he was right. She was. So someone living in America, and at the time when Diana got married, I was just a child, but growing up and watching her in the spotlight and seeing what she intended to do pretty much for the whole world, so the whole world can benefit. It is admirable to see that in a person, to see someone who cares about others, and truly is something that changes a lot of things. I think that there are people out there who feel this way about humanity as a whole. There is something to hope for. Certainly, certainly it is something to think about when we are confronted with moments of despair or difficult times. So, you know, it is very hard to kind of talk about how suddenly she passed away right when she was going to be starting a new era in her life, and perhaps a new era for all of us. You know, her life as a mother, as a philanthropist, as a princess, has left an indelible impression. And I remember something very specifically that the princess had said. She says, when they asked, you know, you tend to touch a lot of the people you're around, you tend to give them hugs, you tend to hold them. And I remember her saying, well, you know, someone, and this is a paraphrase, so I may not have this quote correct, but I remember her saying, well, someone needs to hold them and touch them and care for them. And I remember thinking to myself, you know, this is what, you know, nurses do in a hospital with newborn babies. They hold the babies, and, you know, the newborns need that love and affection and someone to care for them. But as you get older, that's something that you don't get as much, right? You know, there isn't any necessarily always someone there to hold you and to care for you and to do those things. She visited Hale House, I believe, in Harlem, which had babies that were infected with HIV/AIDS at a time in the 80s when no one wanted to have anything to do with these babies. You know, they wanted to pretend like they didn't exist. And she went there, which surprised many people. So yeah, it is a documentary that I think is a beautiful tribute to her. And I'm getting emotional now. Also, if you take away anything from this video, I would say that it's really about a woman whose life was mainly based on compassion and love for her family and those around her. If you get that from this documentary, then watching the documentary has been worthwhile. And I think that that is the intention. No one has a perfect life. No one is perfect. People make mistakes. And even for the princess who changed the world, just remember that none of us, not one of us, are promised tomorrow. So that is my that is my review of The Princess documentary 2022 on HBO. Yeah, it's still very emotional to think about. And it's a beautiful documentary. So please check it out, everybody. I hope you all are well. This is it. I'm turning the computer off. I'm getting my mom in her rotolator. We're going to the boardwalk and we're going to enjoy the day. Hope you all are well out there. Please stay safe. And always remember to be kind. Bye.